About 30 years ago, my brother-in-law barged into my living room, all excited, and connected a box to my TV. He tinkered with it for a few minutes, and then I saw something that changed my life. It had no sound because our TV didn't have an input for the sound cable, but I knew one thing: it was awesome. Later on, when I was older, I was dreaming of a PC, like the ones I saw on TV or in the magazines. Great gray towers with box-like screens. Finally, my dad promised me a computer if I got good grades at school. Even though we were just a poor East European farmer family, he promised me a real computer. My excitement knew no bounds. After a few months, he did bring a computer to our home. The computer turned out to be an Atari 800 XL. And even though it was not a PC and had just a basic programming language and nothing else, I had a lot of fun typing in all the cool examples from the book that came with it, probably from the previous owner. On that Atari, I managed to track down and fix my first bug in someone else's code for a stock market game that I found in some old magazine. I also learned some basics of programming in BASIC and realized that English language will be a major necessity in my future life. Those experiences shaped my whole future, and even though I became a software developer working in Java professionally, I have never given up the dream of being a video game developer. But my efforts were always a bit chaotic, never structured, never progressing towards some concrete goal. I'm sure many of you know that feeling. I always had a lot of holes in my development knowledge, especially the basics. Many times I ditched a project that I started. Rarely did I do a proper closure with some sort of post-release analysis, like a proper post-mortem. Hey guys, it's Potato here. In this movie I'll show you how my game grew from a one-day Flappy Bird clone into an incremental game with bosses and upgrades. If you are not interested in such a long form, I have a short visual changelog clip in the description. Thank you for being here. Here we go! At the beginning of 2026, I decided to kind of restart my game development hobby by doing something called the 20 Games Challenge. It's an idea that's been popular lately on the hobbyist scene, where you do a series of simple remakes of existing games with a gradual level of complexity. This is a way to gain knowledge and experience without spending too much time on game design. And if you try to make a completely fresh game idea, for example during a game jam, then you know how much time you can spend on a game design. There's a lot of different approaches to do the 20 Games Challenge. I chose the one proposed by the authors of 20 Games Challenge GitLab.io. You can also visit their new site, 20gameschallenge.org, but it's under construction, total chaos, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. But on that legacy site, you will find an example path of games for you to make. 10 tiers, each one has a few games you should select one from. Tier 1 has, for example, Pong and Flappy Bird, so you select one of them and you make sure it accomplishes the goals described in the game's description, then you move on to the next tier. Super simple learning path, and the added benefit of this over a course or a tutorial is that you have to make the game totally on your own, which forces you to make decisions and figure stuff out on your own. So in February of 2026 I started tier 1 of the 20 Games Challenge, and I selected Flappy Bird as my project. The game description on the challenge page lists these goals. Create a game world with a floor. Add an object that represents the main character. Apply a constant force to the character so it falls to the floor. Add obstacles on the right of the game area. The obstacles should slide across the screen toward the left. The obstacles will appear in pairs with a vertical gap between them. detect when the character collides with the floor or obstacles, and reset the game when a collision occurs. Accumulate 1 point for each obstacle that the player passes. Display the score. This is the first time I read actual description of the Flappy Bird's gameplay. It seems awkward. Now, this seems like a work for a solid afternoon, right? So here I am, half a year later, and the game is just now finally in testing. Why have I been making a simple Flappy Bird clone for 6 months? Because I gave in to scope creep. Instead of a simple Flappy Bird clone, I now have a Flappy Bird clone with upgrades and boss fights. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you FlappyPlanet, a Flappy Bird in space! I started with the basic functionality of a good Flappy Bird clone. A planet flying in space with mass and gravity. Pressing the spacebar adds force to that planet and the planet jumps. I also added a pair of pipes as obstacles. I didn't want to create a long pre-made level with all the pipes manually placed, of course, so I had to generate them on the fly. I turned the pipe into a prefab and created a pipe generator that manages their creation. Then I added the main menu so that it kind of looks like a real game. To make it more visually pleasing, I added something rarely used in an indie game. A parallax effect. Stop that comment. Of course I'm joking. Parallax effect is almost always used in indie games, usually to create visual depth of an otherwise flat game, increase the sense of speed and distance, but mostly just to juice the game. The game looked now like a prototype someone didn't care to finish. It needed sounds. I was always afraid of Unity's audio system, so I wanted to face my fear already at this stage. I added a simple sound manager and some basic sounds. Next, I created a prototype of the in-game menu. Already you can see I planned upgrades and 3 levels. 1 level for planet, 1 level for star, and 1 level for galaxy, which represents the levels of the Kardashev scale. Each level of that scale represents the civilization's capacity of energy exploitation. Level 1 civilization can use the whole planet's energy, level 2, whole nearby star, and level 3 can use the whole energy of the galaxy it lives in. Kardashev's scale ties the whole game idea nicely, creating clean 3-level structure, and makes energy a very obvious in-game currency.
It really tied the room together.
It's also an essence of hubris. Dreaming of gathering the energy from the whole galaxy is grandiose and megalomaniac, like the final boss. I wanted to make it an incremental game, so the player has to have life. Dying from a single touch would make upgrades very hard to design. No upgrade can help if you die from the first wound. So the planet has a population, which plays the role of a life bar. The population is deducted when the planet hits obstacles or spins too quickly. You can see the RPM counter in the top right. The rotational damage makes the player more careful about the obstacles because even if they survive the hit, they will have to deal with later spin damage, either by counter-hitting another obstacle or depending on upgrades to remedy this. I also added the top and bottom boundaries and the gate counter at the top center. Additionally, I wanted to make the game more entertaining by adding funny text describing how many people died every hit. Sort of dark humor. I noticed my menus look horrible and dated, so I implemented a new in-game menu system. Sort of a console-style main and secondary trigger-style menu. The top options are the main options like system menu, level select, upgrades. The submenus contain particular content like the level select option in the main section contains the 3 levels as submenus. This makes the menus game controller friendly, which is important to me and probably for many other players. Additionally, it's way more scalable. I can simply add another menu screen to the list and it will not be a horrible cluttered screen, but a self-contained coherent section. It did cost me some time to make, but now that I know how to do it, it will make this game and all the other games in the future way more player friendly. I also added dev criteria and really I had all the challenge goals accomplished at this point, but in my head the game was not ready yet, so I created upgrade system with 3 different kinds of upgrades. Energy upgrades influencing the game's currency, which is energy, for an energy farming playstyle. Population upgrades influencing the player's life for the tank brute force playstyle. And planetary upgrades making the game easier mechanically by reducing damage or rotation of the planet. What happened next is basically what the game dev's all about. This is one thing they don't tell you about making games, how tedious it really is. All those upgrades, bosses and gameplay loops sound exciting on paper, but at the end of the day someone has to take a big list of all those things and implement them one by one. Everyone can make games, they say. Game dev is fun and creative, they say. It's all true, but to make a complete game and release it, you also have to genuinely love it because it's hard and boring. So at this point I had to take just a big bucket of upgrades and implement their in-game logic one by one. Here you can see the O-ring upgrade, which increases the amount of energy collected by passing a space gate. Energy is the currency of the game and the main theme of the Kardashev scale, so it fits together nicely. I implemented Android slavery and Viagra energizing therapy, which simply increases the in-game population, which is the player's life, one by addition and the other by percentage. I know from all the Spiffing Brits videos that the percentage one is pretty dangerous, but also the most fun. You can see them working because they create those green plus number text that are visually bugged in this version. I also added a nice little explosion. I implemented the Spin Doctor upgrade that dumps the rotation of the planet. From physics we know that if the planet's rotation is too high, some of the people will get ejected into outer space. Luckily, Earth's rotation is slightly below that limit, but Jupiter's civilization has been fully ejected years ago. I simulate this mechanic in my game with a nice particle effect of tiny people, when the rotation is too high. Spin Doctor upgrade gradually reduces the RPM. Then I thought to myself, well, that's not meeting my scope creep goal. I need more features. Also, I noticed that there is no logical explanation for why the player gets damaged when they leave the game area at the top. In my mind, there needed to be a reason. I mean, dying of simply touching the edge of the screen is like dying of touching an invisible wall, which is lame. I felt I needed to telegraph the danger in some more visual way. So I added a big black hole there. Disclaimer, the lensing shader was generated by AI. I didn't know how to program shaders then, but it looks way cool. On another note, in movie making there is a rule: show, don't tell. You should not display the plot of the movie with exposition dump, which is just a bunch of characters discussing the events important to the movie without showing the events. I believe in game dev we should apply a similar rule. Show, don't display. Simply displaying the energy level go up is not enough. Displaying the number go up and adding a plus 1 gigawatt marker is kind of better. But showing all that, adding a nice sound effect and showing an energy particle getting scooped up by the player when they pass a gate is way more visual. Yay! Scope creep goal achieved! The next logical step was to add a reason why the player gets damaged by touching the bottom of the screen. Adding a second black hole there would look too repetitive and odd, so I added another shader effect, the sun star. This works the same mechanically. Basically, the gameplay difference is just that the sun has to be approached by falling and the black hole has to be approached by jumping in. Maybe I should have added a small gravity to the black hole so that it sucked the player in, and place it at the bottom for the player to jump out of. Let me know in comments if you think this is a good idea. Interesting part is that this sun shader turned out to be very expensive computationally for the mobile version, and I had to replace it with a static sprite on mobile. I changed the energy collection sound because it was crucial for the gameplay, but seriously, the previous sound was less crispy and resembled the Mario's coin sound too much. Too silly for the game. The pipe sprites stay though, to pay homage to the original Flappy Bird. There are space pipes. I continued to work by implementing two new upgrades, Accretion Suction and Star Lifting. They basically generate energy near the sun star and the black hole. The player has to collect that energy by touching it to incentivize risky behavior. When I was testing that version of the game, I noticed that there is nothing that would create excitement further in the gameplay. The player can die at any point, and it will have no impact on their emotions. I wanted the player to think, I simply cannot die now, I'm already at gate 100, I have to survive just a bunch more. But in this version, gate 100 was no different than gate 1. If this was a simple Flappy Bird, gate 100 would matter greatly because you would die of a single touch and the gate counter would reset to 0. But in an incremental game, like this, I can always start over keeping the energy I collected and the gate counter matters little. What if the player lost all the collected energy if they died? I could add the recovery logic, so if you died at gate 40, you would have a big energy particle with all that lost energy waiting for you to recollect at gate 40 the next run. Sort of like in many games nowadays, most notably Dark Souls. But that would be too frustrating for the player in a game like this. This should be a more casual game. I don't see a hardcore gamer playing Flappy Bird clone anyways. What if the price for reaching higher gates was more energy per gate? This way the player could keep their energy, and what they lose on dying is the potential to stockpile copious amounts of energy. I implemented that by redesigning the energy system to have different levels of energy particles. Gray for 1 gigawatt, yellow for 10 gigawatts, red for 100 gigawatts, and blue for 1000 gigawatts. The energy generated by the black hole and the sun star is random, with the higher chance for high energy level particles the longer you last in game. The probability is simply based on the gate number. As you can see, I also designed a boss fight, the first out of 3 planned boss fights. Initially, to advance to the next level in the Kardashev scale, you had to collect enough energy and just press a button. Hardly exciting and making the game more like an Excel sheet than a video game. Video games have to communicate with gameplay. Want to progress a level? You have to beat a boss. Bosses were also needed to tell a story of humanity's hubristic endeavor to conquer the universe. Why would a Flappy Bird game need a plot? Well, it does not need it, but it could add another reason for the player to continue playing, to learn what happens next. In this particular game, what's on the next level of Kardashev scale. Also, it can be skipped by the player entirely, so the cost is pretty low. The first boss is a simple UFO swarm circling around the player and shooting lasers. A pretty normal thing to see in a Flappy Bird clone. To defeat that boss, you had to crash into every UFO. This takes a bit of their and your life. The UFOs regenerate health by collecting energy, so you have to finish off the wounded ones before they steal your precious energy. This was done to make the enemy less trivial to defeat and add some time pressure. I did a complete overhaul of menus and their graphics, using the assets I bought in all the Humble bundles over the years. I also worked a lot on making the menu show correctly in all the different resolutions, which was a very important skill to learn and thing you rarely think about when thinking about game dev. Number one thing that usually made me miserable during working on my games was creating graphic assets. It's slow, It's frustrating because I'm not fluent in it. So I decided to use bought and open licensed assets this time instead of creating my own. But I also wanted to make my game open source. The problem is, I cannot place paid assets in my open repository. This is a common problem when you want to make an open source game. There are some ways to deal with it, like a separate Verdaccio asset registry configured in Unity. I used that before, but I think for a small hobbyist indie project like mine, this is an overkill. I find the easiest solution is a Git submodule. My game contains a private assets submodule, which is simply a private Git repository that has everything that I cannot publish. Git downloads that repo with my credentials when I download the main game public repo. No one else has access to my private parts. I implemented the settings section with some audio settings, but for the high score section, I still have no idea how I can count score in this implementation of Flappy Bird. The gate number makes no sense now that there are boss fights. That would only incentivize edging the boss. Let me know in Discord if you have an idea how to deal with that. I also implemented internationalization with English and Polish languages support. I did that with the standard Unity package for languages. I want to show the game to some people in my country so Polish language will be appreciated. But main reason was learning. I wanted to test how it works. And it works pretty well, nothing to be afraid of. You just make a list of keys and put translations for each key and each language. Unity will detect the default user language and you can provide a menu item to change it. Unity provides a script that will automatically change the text to a key value if the user switches the language, so pretty neat. As a tiny solo indie or a hobbyist game developer, you might not even think about something as important for a modern game as input glyphs. The small icons showing the player what button needs to be pressed to perform a specific action. I implemented a very simple system for that using Kenny's wonderful package. I highly recommend supporting Kenny because he has high quality assets and supported SKG Community Jam with his wonderful prizes. Thanks, Kenny! I also decided that it's a good idea to block further levels until the player defeats the previous boss. This adds curiosity as another reason to try to defeat the bosses. As you can see now, the player has to manually collect the energy between the pipes. I did that because I think collecting collectibles manually is way more satisfying and adds skill into it. This can create some fun gameplay moments for the player when the previous solution was simply increasing a number with an animation. It also limited the power of the upgrades that could potentially generate millions of gigawatts of energy between the pipes. They still can, but the player has to be skilled enough to collect the most of it. Simply put, without this change the game was too much like a clicker game. In previous versions of the game you had to click a separate button to fight a boss. So there were actually two gameplay modes, a normal run and a boss fight. This could easily lead to a misunderstanding. Rule number 15. Giving the player a choice is an invitation to a bad choice. From this point on, there is only one mode. You play normal Flappy Bird and collect energy, and if you fill in the yellow bar in the top center, the boss fight begins. If you defeat the boss, you advance a level. This made each run more risky and each boss fight more precious. If you want to finish the level, you have to survive long enough to encounter the boss, and then learn the boss mechanics without dying, and then defeat the boss. Sort of like in Dark Souls, where you had to do a walk of shame from respawn to those damned Orsten and Smoke, not die along that walk, and then try to defeat them.
comes the sun. Doo-doo-doo-doo.
We know how frustrating it was until you finally beat them, and then it turned out to be the best moment of your entire gaming life. The speed increases all the way up until the boss arrives. And then it gets reset to the starting value. Otherwise you would see the boss when you are flying with the sublight speeds near gate 100, way too hard to think about fighting the boss. But if you upgrade it enough, you could collect the required energy after two gates, and then the boss fight would be way too easy. Was that the right decision? When I was implementing the last boss, I noticed something. The last boss is shooting homing missiles at the player. I realized it would be way cool if the player could parry the rockets in the enemy direction. But how? Simply hitting the rockets to bounce them made no sense. This is what the rocket's supposed to do: hit the target and then explode. I figured I could use the shield to do that. The shield upgrade worked by dumping damage from the enemy weapons, hitting obstacles and staying too close to the sunstar or the black hole. It does that sort of passively. So if I refactored the shield to also have an active mode, that would allow me to do the parry I wanted. Finally, the shield passively dumps the damage as before, but now also has active radius, which can be upgraded. When the player presses jump and something like an enemy or a rocket is in the radius, that thing gets damage and in some cases gets stunned like the UFOs. And if that thing is in a small radius, say 30% of that shield radius, then parry happens. Normal enemies get full damage and get stunned. For rockets, they are bounced back in the opposite direction with a small programmatic nudge in the direction of the boss, courtesy of the game's author. This is what it looks like now. I was thinking that since the shield radius can be increased with upgrades, maybe it should also catch the energy particles. Finally, I didn't do that. Let me know in comments if you think this was a good choice. The problem with that whole shield refactoring was that I now had to implement that behavior for all the previous bosses and enemies. But overall, I think it adds more skill into the gameplay and more opportunities for the player to create in-game moments. Spoiler alert! The final boss is just the player planet, but from the future. What a plot twist! The boss has a full Dyson sphere and a nice evil cloud mustache that's barely visible thanks to my sick GIMP skills. Its gimmick is that it repeats the player's movement, but with a small delay. The player's speed increases and final boss's speed stays the same. So eventually you'll catch up to the boss, hit it with your shield or even parry to give more damage, slow back down, and the loop repeats. You can also hit the boss with his own rockets by parrying them. The funny thing about this was that to implement it, I initially wanted to store just the times when the player hit jump, and then repeat the jump on the enemy a few seconds later. In an ideal world that would work, because if the boss and the planet maintain the same physical properties, if they jump the same, they will also move the same. Of course it didn't work, and the player and the boss started to move differently very quickly. The second version stored the player's velocity and replayed it on the boss sometime later. Of course it didn't work as well, and their movement diverged quickly, although a bit later this time. The final working version just stores the absolute position of the player and applies it on the boss with an offset and a delay. So now, after 6 months of development, I have a fully functional game published on itch.io, Google Play and Unity Play. It does contain a lot of bugs and it's heavily unbalanced. If you would like to help fight those bugs and shape FlappyPlanet and my future development, join my Discord. That's where I post my devlogs and we can vote on design decisions. Currently the open design question is: how should the score work? Gate count, energy collected, maximum population? Something else? Nothing at all? Come, drop your idea in FlappyPlanet design channel. Maybe this game should have been a tiny project. Because of the scope creep and my, let's say, creator's vision, it turned out to be a full small indie game, or what we called in 2000s a flash game. But at least it's a full vertical slice of a video game with core gameplay, save game, menu system, sounds, animations, particles, input system, shaders and internationalization. Now that I learned all those basics, I can focus on making tiny versions of them as fast as possible during the rest of my 20 games challenge. I had a lot of fun designing and making this game. Even though it was way bigger than it needed to be, and it was hard and tedious to make, just like any other big project, I do not regret it. So that's it. Now just a lot of testing and fixes. Tell me what you think about all this. What's your approach to this hobby? See you in the devlog for the next game in 20 Games Challenge series. It will be shorter, I promise. Thanks for watching. Bye!